This is not an industry that moves very fast. Projects take many years to build, so progress to the outsider seems slow, but I do believe we're making progress.
Welcome to The Power of Construction, a Procore podcast recording live at Groundbreak this week. We're sitting down with leaders across the industry who are evolving their business today to build a better industry tomorrow. I'm Sasha Reed.
And I'm Chris Langizo.
And before we get started, Chris, I do want to give a clear nerd alert today. We are going to be nerding out hard and deep on data and technology. And we're very, very excited to be bringing to the stage and to sit down with us today, Jit Kee Chin, the Chief Technology Officer at Suffolk Construction. If you're not familiar with Jit Kee, let me tell you a little bit about her background. Since joining Suffolk, she has spearheaded the company's commitment to harness big data, advanced analytics, robotics, digitization, and technology. Co-founder and managing partner of Suffolk Technologies, the venture capital that funds the next generation of companies solving the built environment challenges. She was also recently named an industry pioneer for her innovative contributions to construction. She's also been awarded the Built World's Maverick Award in 2019, Construct Tech Women in Construction in 2018, and Boston Business Journal's 40 Under 40 in 2018. Prior to Suffolk, Jit Kee was an associate partner and senior expert at McKinsey and Company, where she advised on strategic, commercial, and analytics projects. She holds a BS degree in physics and English literature from Caltech, and she earned her PhD in physics from MIT. What a resume. You know why I gave the alert. Welcome, Jit Kee, to the podcast.
Thank you, Sasha. Delighted to be here.
Really excited for this episode. As Sasha mentioned, this is a nerd alert. I've been looking forward to this episode since we put it on the planning doc. So we're going to get right into the nerdy stuff very early, and it'll be fun. So Jit Kee, we talk a lot about the productivity challenges in the industry, and we talk a lot about it on this podcast. And McKinsey recently released their new report, Delivering on Construction Productivity is No Longer Optional. And they state that the industry is still lagging behind in productivity. And this is an update to their 2017 report on reinventing construction through a productivity revolution. So we've been talking about productivity. We've been talking about the need to get more productive in our industry for quite some time. But I guess my question to you, we're in an industry where we desperately need to build more, build faster, build bigger, because things are just getting more complex. What's your take on the data and how concerned we should be maybe that the industry doesn't maybe seem to be getting much more efficient?
Yeah, Chris, we've all heard the challenges with productivity on this industry. And, when I was new to the industry, I looked at it and was like, wow, that seems really bad. But after being in the industry for about 7-8 years, I just have a slightly more nuanced view of that now. First of all, I do think that parts of the industry is getting better. And it's kind of hard when you look at these academic studies. And I'm speaking as a recovering academic myself.
I love that.
We love recovering academics.
You got to put frameworks into place. You got to make sure, the numbers only tell you so much. But one of the things that's true is in reality, what we're building is getting more complex, right? We are building structures that are not just simple boxes anymore. It's the amazing structures that we've seen at Groundbreak here today being built. And how do you size that complexity, right? And so is it taking us more time, more cost, more people to build increasing complexity? Potentially. But at the same time, the quality of that output is quite different. The other aspect of it is that if you look in the past, things like safety, how's that quantified? Used to be, construction is still a high hazard industry, but we've gotten a lot better on
Absolutely.
The safety dimension. And so some of that increased, sort of oversight and increased focus on, frankly, the human value is also hard to quantify. Having said all that, look, at the end of the day, you just have to ask any practitioner and you can say, hey, do you think we're the most efficient we can be? And the answer is going to be no.
Yeah.
Right? Like you go on a job site, you look at, if you sort of poured a deck with the embeds wrong and you have to rip it up and do rework. If you have change orders that come in and all of a sudden now you have to change the design and, change your sequencing to accommodate the changes, well, that that maybe could have been avoided if we had better planning up front. So lots of examples, practitioners know it. And I think we as an industry are really focused on improving this. It's just this is not an industry that moves very fast. Projects take many years to build. So progress to the outsider seems slow, but I do believe we're making progress.
Yeah, I think that's so critical when we talk about like the outsider looking in versus maybe those of us actually living it and being on the inside looking out. I mean, I could tell you in the last 10 years, I've seen a significant change in the way that we do things. But I couldn't stand in front of you and say, yeah, we have no room for productivity improvements. We have so much room for productivity improvements. So I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we've made big strides. We're coming from an industry that 10 years ago, everybody was pretty much still on pen and paper and clipboards, right? And so like there's an evolution. It takes time for these things to actually like uptake and then also for us to take advantage of them. Now, what I will agree with, and I'd love to get your reaction to these, McKinsey in their new report talks about kind of 4 things we need to focus on. I actually do think these things are pretty accurate. The first one is really nurturing our ecosystem of suppliers across projects. I think there's so much opportunity for us to find better ways to work with the ecosystem and not just do it on a project by project basis, but at a more portfolio basis. We have to upskill our people, right? They talk about upskilling the people in the industry. I think there are so many skills that don't exist today in the industry that we will need in the future, and we need people to learn new skills in our industry. They talk about scaling initiatives across project portfolios. I mean, we've talked to several people, and we'll call back to Eric Hubry on his podcast talking about how they're trying to scale innovation across Arco construction. And then we have to apply technology in a way that's actually going to make a difference on productivity. Any thoughts on those 4 things? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
Yeah, no, look, Chris, I absolutely agree with those 4 things. And to be honest, those are the things that we as an organization have been focused on for a long time. So people first, it's always about people first. The technology, data, and all of that can only take you so far. If we're fundamentally a physical industry, a lot of people have to come together and collaborate in order to put that building up. And if the people aren't getting together, communicating, collaborating, and then taking the right decisions, that building doesn't go up despite all of the technology that we have at our disposal.
Buildings don't build themselves.
Yep, they don't. Well, one day maybe they will,
Maybe
Chris.
they will.
But if
We get into like nanotechnology. Here's the nerdy part, folks. We can get into like nanobots and self-building steel and stuff like that in the future, but we're not there yet.
20 years from now,
yes,
you and I will sit
yes.
down here and we'll talk about the self-building buildings. But until then, people have to work together to get that building up. And if we don't drive that feeling of, urgency, upskill our people, upskill the industry to leverage new techniques, new technology to make better decisions to put that building up, then that progress is not going to happen. So that's on the people side. Scaling is another big focus of ours at Suffolk. And we went through a period perhaps where, like everybody else, we were experimenting with things and there were pilots here and there. And, it made for the good occasional news article, but it didn't actually drive any actual change on the ground. And so a few years back, we sort of said, look, that's not going to move the needle. That's not going to move the dial. So let's just be very clear about what's going to make a difference. And let's put all our effort behind it to drive that difference. And that's everything from, and that's not just the data and technology. That really is about change management, communication, working new technology into standard processes, teaching our people how to use these new techniques, right? And always communicating and leading from the top, which we do have from our CEO and chair. That is the focus. And today, I think we're very proud to say that we have a very systematic process of scaling these initiatives where you have stage gates to evaluate, hey, does this work? Does this not work? What value did it deliver? And then if it works, you move from like an experiment onto like a more scaled pilot, from scaled pilot onto, best practices or company-wide SOP, right? And that's a good pipeline, healthy pipeline. We always make sure to fill the top of the funnel. And, not everything makes it through, but those that make it through deliver real impact for our projects. So I think scaling is terribly important. And I think the last one, data technology, even if that's not all of it, I don't want I don't want to downplay it either because, things are the way they are for a reason because that was the set of techniques and tools available to folks, back then. When we have new capabilities available to us, when we have new technology available to us, they can fundamentally change our process. They can fundamentally make things that were just not possible before possible. And so we got to build that in. We got to leverage that. And, the tough part there is also sometimes people finding the good technologists, finding the right data scientists, finding the right, product manager that can help you to bridge the conversation between what's needed on the ground in operations and what the technology can enable. That's also difficult, right? And so we also got to train and encourage and mentor, foster a whole new generation of construction technologists that can actually build the right tools for us to use in our projects going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that's part of that skills, I think, that we may not have in our industry. It might be a great opportunity for people that are doing that in other industries to come and learn about, our industry. And I mean, I think Sasha's going to ask a question about this, but that's interesting part about your path into the industry as well, as you came from a bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, that's where mine went when she was talking. And Jit Kee, you talked about two things, change management, and you talked about finding those people who become the bridges between the field and the technology. I'm really curious, this outside in perspective that you have, and I read your resume a bit coming into this. And so we're looking at physics, English literature, consulting. So there's clearly this unique combination of almost a scientific rigor and curiosity. How have you seen that guiding or leading the way that you're approaching technology and change management with Suffolk?
It's a great question, Sasha. I don't know that I quite have the answer, but I'll try and answer that. So I think overall, if you ask my parents, one of my defining characteristics is that of curiosity. So I was that annoying kid that when you watch TV, will always go, so why is that? Why is that? And, the answer drove my parents crazy. And the answer is always, just watch the show. You know as much as I do. And eventually you'll find out why. But driven by this kind of, my career has been driven by this curiosity. So I started out in physics because I was very curious to learn how the natural world works, right? What are the laws of physics? Why does an apple drop, right? Why are things the way they are? But that's in the natural world. When I joined McKinsey, it was to learn how large organizations work and how do you drive change in the real world. So, and a lot of the real world change is driven by people, right? So how do you take a decision analytically often, right? How you to decide the path, you got to look at the factors, analyze the market forces, etc. But then how do you win hearts and minds? How do you set a direction? How do you get people to follow you? And then how do you systematically drive that organizational change? And my nearly 10 years at McKinsey, I've been privileged to work with a large number of organizations across both the private sector, the public sector, the third sector in the nonprofit world, et cetera. I had the privilege of working with folks that knew how to do that. They knew how to drive organizational change at scale. So when I came to Suffolk, I think I brought that curiosity with me. I loved the industry, and I came to the industry because I saw first the potential to actually make an impact and to add value, even if I didn't know the industry when I first came in. But secondly, because this industry is one that's deeply rooted in communities and it has such a massive influence on our daily lives, right? We build the buildings and spaces in which we work, live, and play. And I was passionate to make a difference in this industry. So the curiosity, for me, I'm always just anchored on what will work. Forget the rhetoric, forget the frameworks. All of that is important in service of what will work. But it is always being laser focused on understanding, hey, what's going to actually move that needle and move that dial. And so when we talk a little bit about our journey, perhaps later on, it's all about getting that insight when you plan that first path. And when I first joined, there wasn't necessarily a path for how do you drive a data transformation in a construction company. It wasn't really a thing. I mean, it was very early.
Well, let's go right there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you joined Suffolk. You had to kind of look at this industry that, for some respects, you were unfamiliar with. I mean, you'd done your research, I'm sure, but how did you assess the business and their readiness for one, their readiness for change, because that was the place you came from, but also where they were with their systems and processes, and what did you learn kind of early on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So absolutely, like everybody else, this is like strategy 101. You come in, or new exec 101, you come in, you perform your assessment, right? And so I assessed it across a couple of different dimensions. One is clearly the data and systems part. You got to have the facts at your fingertips, right? So what are the systems that are being used? What's the different systems of records? What do we use for project management, for schedule, for safety, for financials, HR, etc. And then what state was the data in? Like what is the important information in this industry? What was like your master data elements? What are transactional data? What was like permanent records that like you needed to know? And so we did that classic assessment. The second piece of the assessment that was perhaps even more important is what we call like use cases, like developing use cases and understanding potential value. So in McKinsey, they sort of teach this classic use case first approach that says, all right, well, once you understand what data and technology can deliver, you got to articulate how are you going to transform, the way you do safety or the way you do pre-construction or the way you do scheduling, right? And when you articulate how it can be different, what is the associated value, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not enough to drive change for the sake of change. You got to understand what potential value you got to capture. It's not going to be exact. This is a strategic assessment, not a financial like business planning assessment. But it gives you a sense of scale, and it tells you like, hey, where might you be able to make a meaningful difference? And then you assess the level of effort, right? Classic framework is you want the kind of high value, relatively low
high
effort
impact,
things. Yeah,
low
to
effort.
start, just get that momentum going, right? And so we did that use case map and assessment. And I have to say, broadly speaking, it holds true today. The techniques may have shifted. Which ones we picked to start with might have changed. But roughly speaking, that's remained intact. And then the third dimension, which is probably the most important, is a bit more of an art rather than a science. Maybe that's where the English literature comes in, right?
I think so.
You got to assess the people.
Yeah.
Where are the leaders, champions, and sponsors that are ready to drive that change? Because you can't drive a data technology transformation with just the tech or the data leading, right? You have to do it as part of an entire management system change. And to drive that management system change, you need the right leaders at the top that can put in place then the different elements like process shifts, like, sort of incentives, like role modeling, right? Things that's going to like win hearts and minds and bring the organization along. You need that, you need those people there. So then you assess the different domains for like, who's ready for that change right now. Because you can't start with the whole organization all at once. You got to start in a specific area before you scale.
And for you, I think that area for Suffolk was safety. You had this combination of, you had good data. You had, I think a new leader in safety at that point that really wanted to drive some of these things forward. Why was that such a logical first place to start? And did that set you up for success and kind of build a foundation for future efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually funny, Chris. Safety was the visible starting point. And it was actually a two-pronged approach that we took. And there was an invisible starting point. Safety just happened to be the one that we talked about a fair amount because we were really passionate about safety and wanted to lead the change there. But the two-pronged approach that we took was, one, we needed to get quick wins. And we picked safety because, well, first of all, is safety. Safety first, right? It's a kind of no-brainer kind of starting point.
Yeah, nobody's going to argue with saving people's lives.
No one's going to argue with it. So that's from an impact perspective, right? On the level of effort perspective, the safety data was actually not, from a data perspective, not that complex. There were not a lot of primary interdependencies. Like many organizations do inspections, we do observations. They're typically quite structured data, right? You can put a risk weighting on them. And it's relatively clean. We've been reporting safety outcomes to OSHA for, decades. The data has been curated and has been available, and there's a good record of it, if you like. So from a data perspective, the data was pretty clean. And then analytically, it was easy to understand what we needed to achieve with safety. Like what you need to achieve is you want to have zero incidents. You want as few incidents as possible. The goalpost
was very clearly set out in front of you.
Yeah, you want to prevent them from happening in the first place. And so with combination of a manageable problem from a technical perspective with a very high impact, certainly from a human cost perspective, but also a financial cost in terms of the insurance angle and the kind of workers' comp claims and whatnot. All of that just added up. And when you add that dimension of having a new leader who was passionate to drive change into the mix, right, it was a logical place to start. And we really started with safety and went deep on it. And that reinforced Suffolk's culture of really caring about people and putting our people first.
And then did that like set a playbook or a methodology for like, hey, this is how we approached it on safety. This is how we were able to drive change here. Now we can do this more at scale because we understand Suffolk, we understand the culture of the people, and we know that we can drive change forward?
Yeah, it did. It's certainly having that early visibility and momentum helps get the buy-in to drive that second prong that I mentioned, right? Which was less visible because it was a longer burn. More important in a way, because it actually set the foundation for the whole company, but maybe slower to sort of yield dividends, right? But that's actually the journey that we were on that kind of builds up the entire foundation. So that second prong, we started with what we call the project dashboard. And the dashboard is just like the very tip of that iceberg, because in order to get that project dashboard, we had to set the data foundations, right? We had to bring in, we all know that we use Primavera P6 for schedule. We have Procore for our PM system of CMS, right? We have a safety system that we had put in place. There were financials that we were pulling from our ERP. In order to get an overall view of the project, you had to get the information from all of these different systems into one place. And we had project teams back then that were putting together 11 by 17 Excel kind of dashboards that were manual, where they had to manually look into each system, type that number into that Excel kind of placemat. And then every week, some poor admin would be spending half a day putting it together for the executive to review.
Yeah, or a poor project engineer.
Yeah, or a poor project engineer, right? And with the technology that we have, we don't have to do that anymore. So we started the difficult effort of bringing all the different data from the different systems into a central data lake and then clean it up, put it into a data warehouse, and use that data warehouse to feed a real-time digital dashboard that could automate all of that work. But more than the automation, what that really gave us was the transparency. And it gave us that transparency up and down the organization. So at the project level, your project executive or your project manager are entrusted in a certain set of things. But when you move up, like your regional vice president of operations, your regional general manager, and then at the national level, each of them were interested in the same underlying set of information, but synthesized differently, right?
Yeah.
Because the decisions that they took were different. So the vision from that one was like, hey, we need to build that foundation step by step and start with the project at the unit, but then building all the way up the organization to really drive the transparency of information and to provide the level of synthesis and analysis to folks that can actually eventually drive better decision making.
Well, and this really highlights the partnership that needs to happen between IT, the data team, operations. If they don't collaborate together, you're not actually going to get to a place where you can deliver those dashboards that an executive's answering the questions that they have. Can you explain why that's so important and how you've tackled some of that challenge at Suffolk?
Yeah, absolutely. That is super critical. We often talk in Suffolk about this trifecta between data, IT, and operations. And to understand why the trifecta is so important and, what each party brings to the table, it's important to say, hey, what is the expertise and the DNA of each kind of constituent, if you like, and how do you best leverage each other's strengths to drive a way forwards? So, with data, even though data and IT are both technical sort of departments, right? Part of the culture is sometimes quite different, especially in the early days. Data needs to be extremely close to the business because you need to know what drives value.
Yeah, they need to be embedded. You need to
be embedded. You need to really understand business value drivers. You really need to talk the language of the business, right? In the data and the numbers. And you need to be always, especially for analytics, right? You need to be very agile, always very curious mind, trying to get to what matters. And so that agility, that kind of closeness to the business and that type of analytical mindset may not be part of what traditionally IT is known for, right? IT traditionally has to be really good at stability. It has to be really good at kind of managing systems and applications and vendors, right? It has to be very good at implementation, rollout, preparing the organization for new technology that's going to come online. That maintenance of infrastructure, maintenance of uptime is also very crucial part of making this work, right? The third one on operations. Operations obviously kind of knows what matters. They're the ones that take the decision on the ground every day. And, they know the realities of what they face. So they bring like, hey, here's the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, they're the ones with the questions.
Yeah, they're the ones with the questions, and they're the ones that have to take the action, right? And frankly, operations is really good at, at operations, at activity, at doing things, scaling out, managing their people, right? And so when you bring all three together, you get that capability to brainstorm and create ideas for new tools and new solutions that each one individually may not have been able to do in isolation, right? So what we did is that we have this cross-functional kind of collaboration going between our operations excellence department, our IT department, and our data department. Operations typically specs the pain points, and then, we kind of solution together, if you like. And then from a delivery perspective, the data and IT teams work very closely together to access the information, set up the environments, build the solutions, and then delivery then gets handed back over to operation to communicate and drive the change out to the organization.
I was going to say, and I think there's a few key points you brought up there. Well, first of all, you were speaking Chris's love language. The minute you said dashboards, I was like, and there it is. Now I understand why Chris was so like, I can't wait for this episode. I love that about you. But you also mentioned something else that was really interesting, which reminds me of another thought leader in industry, like a respect for perspective and this idea of understanding the different perspective of those different stakeholders. And you talked about speaking the business's language. And to me, that's such an important part of why sometimes as we're trying to push technology to these different stakeholders, there's a rejection of it because we start without speaking their language in their conversation. But I think this also comes to the culture of the organization then has to be able to accept that change. So I'm really curious how you addressed the culture of Suffolk when it came to thinking data first, adopting technology, and really transforming how the business had been operating.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I haven't spoken about culture enough on this so far. So maybe let me spend a little bit of time talking about culture, because it is absolutely a critical enabler for any change that you want to drive through. And understanding how to impact that culture, I think, is important. I think, look, you got to start with where your organization is, right? And what is the existing culture of the organization. And at Suffolk, I think the organization has always been very innovative, very keen to find new ways to do things in a better way. And that predated my arrival at Suffolk. It's led from the very top. I think our CEO himself is a very dynamic CEO, John Fish. He's always looking for new ways to do things better. And he was the one that made the investment into the chief data officer role that brought me on at the very beginning, at a time when that wasn't a common role for construction companies to have, right? The industry is also, so that's one starting point, right? Like there is that thirst to improve, that thirst to get better. I think the second starting point, I think this is true for the industry and not just Suffolk, is that we're a very competitive industry. Right?
Oh, yes, we are. We love a good scoreboard.
Yeah, a good scoreboard. And you got to understand that kind of play to that, right? Play to that when you sort of design your change journey. So I think that was another kind of aspect of it. And so what we found out, this wasn't like maybe, hindsight is always 2020. I wouldn't say foresight was 2020, but what we found out over time is, one, the reason dashboards are important in the data journey is that it gives the transparency into the numbers. You start to be able to do things like leaderboards. You start to be able to do things like red, amber, green a number to tell folks when things were out of tolerance or intolerant and when we needed to have a conversation over it. And that transparency and that kind of gamification, if you like, drove, well, first of all, competitiveness. Like if you put something on a leaderboard, everybody wants to know why they're not top of the leaderboard and
I
what
want to
they
be
can
top
do
dog.
to change so that they could be top of the leaderboard. And it then drove focus on the data. So we could have, another way to go about it might have been just to preach and say, hey, data is really important. You got to get your processes right and put the data in properly. But that would have probably not been as effective, right? Like, they're like, why do we care about data? We're building buildings. Like, I put my whatever change order in the system and that's it. And I don't need to fill all these fields. Because they didn't see the value coming back to them. And it was just like an additional thing to do at the end of a very long day of building buildings. But when you make that information, serve it back to folks, make it transparent, all of a sudden there's all that attention being paid to it. And then it drives curiosity. We talked a little bit earlier about curiosity, right? And the industry is curious. Like, hey, why is this number, sort of red? Like, why is this? And when you explain back to them, hey, that's just what what you've put in. And, if you don't think it's right, then you're going to have to go back and change what you put in. Like, there's no magic here. I didn't do anything to it. And you sort of see that realization catching and say, hey, if I clean up my processes and if I input the information in a certain way, all of a sudden I'm getting this dividend back. Like, I'm getting back information that's helping me build better, that's helping me take better decisions. And that's just a start, because now if everybody starts doing it, I can leverage the information from across the company. No longer is each project its own individual island, which it kind of is, right? Each project is its own P&L, its own geographic location, its own hierarchy. But now I can start to leverage the strength of everybody around, because everybody now is like moving in the same direction and doing things a certain way, and I can learn from it. And even more, it gives me a better way to have a conversation with a client. Like, if you're trying to have a conversation with a client to say, well, this change that you're asking for, this is going to be, how much it's going to cost or what's the schedule delay. It's one thing to be able to say this because I think this is what's going to be. It's another thing to say, I have the experience from like 40 years of our company's history that this is what it's going to cost. Here's all the benchmarks and the information that's going to generate, right? Like, all of a sudden, it augments an individual's ability to do their jobs. And I think, that realization did hit. So from a cultural perspective, starting with dashboards actually was really important for us to drive that cultural shift. Now, the other part of that cultural shift that folks do need to watch out for is rejection of the transparency. And folks reject that transparency if they feel like it's being used as a stick and not something that actually helps. So, one of the things that we started driving a lot with this, when this transparency gave a lot of visibility to performance, is no-fault culture, right? Like, from the very top, we sort of said, look, we are on the learning journey. First time you make something transparent, it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to be right, but we got to learn from it and move on.
That's powerful.
Right?
Very
There's
important.
that F word again that we talk about every once in a while.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just no fault culture. Just learn. The ask is not that everything is perfect, because everything is never perfect. But the ask is that we learn from what is not perfect and grow. We learn from our failures. We learn from what we did wrong. And if growth stops, then
Why are we doing it?
why are we doing it? So I think those two elements of culture, super important. And after a while, you then get over the resistance and you get folks then asking for more, because then you trigger the curiosity and now the pull starts to happen.
Yeah, that's that magical moment where people start to go, oh, wait, I'm starting to see how this works. What else? What other questions can I answer?
That's right.
And then you become this very popular person or department inside of the organization where the requests just start to like pile in, which is a great problem to have, because now we start to think about prioritizing and moving things forward.
And just on that note, Chris, I'm going to add one thing. The thing that really caught a lot of project executives' attention after the dashboards right now is when once the data got cleaner, we started to use it to drive predictions.
Yep.
So it's just looking forward instead of looking back, right? Looking back, things are done, they're baked,
Yeah. I can't change it now.
Can't change it now. But when we started talking to our project executives about, hey, here's the set of things that we've now analyzed that can show you, like, what are the early indicators to drive fee erosion? what are the early indicators for increased safety risk, right? What might be the early indicators of schedule slippage? Now, all of a sudden, folks are really interested.
This is a perfect segue. And I want to tap into your curiosity a little bit here. What are you most excited about? Maybe some of your future predictions that are coming into the industry, and what do you think is going to have like the future? What's going to make the biggest impact on our industry from what you're seeing?
It's a really tough question, Chris. Depending on the day you ask me, the answer sort of changes. Look, I think since it's today and since we're at Groundbreak, there are a few key technology areas that I watch, and we're constantly thinking about it and thinking about its implications for our industry. The first is AI, and we saw a lot about Procore Copilot. We saw heard a lot about agents and bots, and can really help improve efficiency and, take away a lot of the non-value add time that folks have to spend on the job site today.
Maximize the human.
Right, really maximize the human and the value adding kind of components, take away a lot of the drudgery, right? I think AI does have this potential to automate things, automate a lot of tasks for us on the job site and change the way we do things. Part of the reason it can do that is that it could radically change the way we interact with information in this industry. And the challenge with information in the industry isn't necessarily like how much of it there is, because there are other industries with more. It's just how different it is.
And how big the gap is between the people who need it and how they can access it.
How do you serve it up at the right time to the right people? And I think AI has the ability to help us fundamentally change that, right? So that's kind of one area I'm watching. The next area I'm watching is robotics, and AI also has implications in the robotics. I think there's been a lot of hype about robotics recently, and the reality is most people are still in the piloting, experimenting phase. There are very few scaled applications of robotics in our industry. And I think with good reasons, right? For another podcast, we can talk about what those are.
That's a whole podcast on its own.
But eventually it's going to come, right? The structural factors, the labor shortages, the lack of productivity, and the increasing improvements in the technology means that one day it will come. And so we're watching this trend and kind of where it makes sense, driving adoption of a better way to build. I think the third area that's quite exciting is materials. We didn't talk about sustainability very much on this podcast, but it is undeniably, a factor on top of a lot of people's minds. Like, what does sustainability mean? How do we build for a more sustainable future? And so a lot of innovations in materials are now happening, which is where we as an industry can make a difference in terms of embodied carbon. And that's a third category that I'm kind of watching.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think each one of them probably could be its own
An
podcast.
entire podcast.
Yeah. So future nerd alert. All right. We're now at that point of the podcast where I ask you 5 rapid fire questions. So quick, short answers. Some people are really, really short answers. Some people are not so short, but try and keep them quick and into the point. So is there a book that you're reading or have read that you would recommend to others?
Yeah. So, on this one, the most recent book I read, or reread actually, I first read it when I was a kid, about robotics, was Isaac Asimov's I, Robot. Yeah. If you have not read that book, it is a classic. It's surprising because I think Sagan once had a quote, if enough people dream a future, those dreams become maps.
Yep.
And a lot of what we see today, in the world, like a lot of the scientific breakthroughs that we've seen, is actually due to, 5 decades ago, 6 decades ago, a generation of folks who dreamed a certain way. And so for all the people looking at the advancements in robotics today, I encourage you to go back and reread that classic.
Awesome. What's your go-to source for gaining maybe a different perspective or more information than you have about the topic?
Yeah, so news is so polarized nowadays that the only way to gain a differentiated perspective or form a balanced view is to actually get it from multiple sources. So what I encourage folks to do here is to go read news from both ends of the extreme to try and figure out what the different perspectives are, right? I think for a really balanced view, I've always liked The Economist. I think they are fairly well balanced. But for a lot of other news sources, I try to pick and choose.
If you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Ask more questions?
Probably not. I may not have survived to today if I had asked more questions. I think it is to actually focus on building relationships. I mean, I trained as a scientist. I always had a very logical, scientific background. And sometimes like the analytical side of your mind can really get in the way of building the relationships, which ultimately is what makes work more joyful and creates impact, at least in the human world, right?
Love that.
I think building more relationships, focusing more time on that'd be mine.
All right, we kind of already hit this one, but what's one trend or innovation that you think will shape the future of construction? And you got to pick one of the three.
Oh, gosh. I have to pick AI today, Chris. We're at Groundbreak. We have to pick AI.
All right. And if the construction industry had a tagline, what would it be?
I can tell you what I want the tagline to be.
I love it. Dream big, and maybe more of us will dream that way.
The tagline I want it to be is build tomorrow today. Don't wait for tomorrow to come. Don't wait for somebody else to drive that change, but build tomorrow today because you are going to make a difference.
I couldn't think of a better way to end than that.
And that really sums up even the essence of why we're doing the podcast. Jit Kee, thank you so much for sitting down with us today and joining us. We really appreciate hearing your perspectives. And if what you've heard today has resonated with you in some way, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll keep bringing you the stories of leaders who are reshaping our industry, harnessing the power of construction.